All righty. Is it 10 o'clock? Looks close to it. Yeah, 10:01. All right. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started. Started talking last week about the autonomy of the local congregation and about how important that is to God's design for the church. And again, just to kind of recap, is that we don't see some higher ecclesiastical structure, right? We don't see a state level organization and a regional level organization and a national organization when it comes to the Lord's church. The closest thing we see that we talked about last week is the Council of Jerusalem that happens in Acts chapter 15. And if we take a look at the context of what is going on there, we see that the apostles and the elders of the church at Jerusalem gathered together to consider the matter of Gentile Christians. What is it that they should have to obey? Do they need to obey the law of Moses? What are they supposed to do? And again, this is after the church there had sent out Paul as a missionary, and it is kind of them reporting back to them about the success and bringing this question before them. So there's a certain element of the church at Jerusalem being a sponsoring congregation, right? But we don't see record of congregations, writing to the elders at the church at Rome about this, that, or the other, or writing to this mother church about this, that, or the other. And so we very much see a design of the local congregation is meant to be autonomous, make its own decisions, and it is overseen by elders. And that is the pattern that we see in the New Testament. And so, as such, any questions about that from last week before we move into the next part of the local church? Right? So then it becomes the responsibility of the local church to determine how it is going to conduct the mission of the church, right? Which the twofold mission of the Lord's church, number one, is to seek and save the lost. Number two is to equip the saints for the work of ministry, right? To do the things that God has called us to do. And that there is admittedly some flexibility in how that goes about, right? But here are a couple of things that we see local congregations engaging in. Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, if you want to turn there, we'll start with this one. This is an oldie but a goldie, right? This is Paul here. They are, let's see, back it up, at Troas. And it says, on the first day of the week, this is Acts 20, verse 7, on the first day of the week, when we gathered together to break bread, Paul intending to talk to them, intending to depart the next day, he prolonged his speech until midnight. All right, so this, we see the local congregation is meeting on the first day of the week, right? And Paul and his companions arrived in Troas, and they waited or stayed for 7 days, and then on the first day of the week. So they get there on like a Monday, right? And so then they wait 7 days, and on Sunday, the church at Troas is gathered together to break bread. Now, several things there is Paul is an apostle of God. Why not just call a meeting on Tuesday night? Right? You have to ask that question, right? Why would Paul not have just said, hey, I'm in town, everybody show up to so-and-so's house? Because we know they met in homes, right? So why would it have been significant for him to wait 7 days until the first day of the week? He was being purposeful. Okay? Tommy? It's the day the saints met, right? The first day of the week is when the tomb was found empty. It is the first day of the week when the church met as a total body, right? And so there is something very significant about Sunday, right? The first day of the week is Sunday. You know, we sometimes think, oh, well, I start work on a Monday, so Monday's the first day of the week. Monday is not the first day of the week, right? Sunday is the first day of the week. And the early church, one of the things that almost no one argues about is the fact that the early Christians met on a Sunday, right? They met on the first day of the week. And that tells us that as a local body, it is vitally important that we meet on the first day of the week. Now, we see elsewhere, Acts chapter 2 and other places, that they met other times, right? The early church, especially in Acts chapter 2, seems to have met every day, but they did not meet as one body except on Sunday. And so other days of the week, maybe they were meeting in small groups in homes, or they were meeting in little, parts of town. And so, but on Sunday, it was the first day of the week, and specifically, Paul says that they had gathered together to break bread. Now, we also know that they partook of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. And so the purpose of gathering on the first day of the week, it's not to listen to a sermon, right? It is to see one another, but the primary purpose of the assembly on Sunday is for the purpose of breaking bread, the purpose of the Lord's Supper, to proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. And so that is why we gather together, and then the rest of it is supporting of that purpose. Do you have something, Warren? Great question. So the question that Warren asked is that referring to just the Lord's Supper or also a meal? And in the first century, they were together. So in the first century, the Lord's Supper was a part of what we would call a fellowship meal or a potluck meal. So they didn't do it like we do it today, where 2 songs prayer, 2 songs Lord's Supper, scripture reading, sermon, invitation song. And so they had a fellowship meal. They were called agape meals, and within the context of that meal is when the Lord's Supper would be taken. So for the early church, the two were entwined, and that's what Paul gets on to them about in 1 Corinthians when he tells them, "Do you not have homes to eat and drink in?" Right? Because they are profaning the Lord's Supper. And we're used to our little cups, and you go, "Who's getting drunk off of that?" Right? Well, it's because it was part of a larger meal that they were having, that people were getting drunk and were profaning the Lord's Supper. So we see this phrase, breaking bread, and more often than not, it does refer to, and it can be translated breaking the bread, and more often than not, it does refer to the Lord's Supper. And really, you just kind of have to look at context. Acts chapter 2, if you want to turn over there, it gets really, I want to say thorny, but, well, all right. I will, so, all right. Acts chapter 2, all right. 42, okay? "And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, and to the breaking of bread and the prayers." All right? Literally, that is the breaking of the bread. "All came upon every soul. Many wonders and signs were being done through all the apostles. All who were believed together and had all things in common, and they were all selling their possessions and belongings and distributing proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received food with glad and generous hearts." And so you read that, and you have breaking bread in 42 and breaking bread in their homes 46, and it looks like it's the same thing. But most commentators would suggest that they are not the same thing. That 42 is specifically referring to, apostles' teaching, to fellowship, the Lord's Supper, and prayers, whereas 46 would be referring more to a fellowship meal or a potluck, right? And so same phrase, but one has the definite article, one doesn't in the Greek, but also just kind of the context of it. And you say, that's interesting. How could that steer us wrong? I'm glad you asked. I actually this week had a person reach out to me they had some Bible questions because they asked me, is it okay at a wedding on a Friday to partake of the Lord's Supper? That was the question I got asked. Anybody, any takers, pro or yay? Yeah, Greg. Any other takers? Tommy? Yeah. Anybody else? All right, we got one in favor, one against. All right. Any other takers? All right, Bellefonte, why is it okay? Fair enough. Tommy? Any? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Bellefonte? Because he likes bread and grape juice. So, yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. And so they technically took it on Passover, which Passover was not on Sunday, right? Now, those who advocate for the anytime position point to 1 Corinthians 11:26. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. All right? So, however, you know me, I hate to come down on any one spot. However, what I will say is we don't have record of the early church really taking the Lord's Supper other days. So there's not really a historical evidence to it. The second thing is the Lord's Supper is almost exclusively contingent on the concept of when you've gathered together, right? So the church needs to gather together. Now, what is the church? That's a good question. So it becomes when two or three are gathered, right? So the church has gathered. So one could make that argument, right? But the specific illustration I had was a Friday night at a wedding, right? What is the purpose of a wedding? It's a celebration of what? Two people getting married. Correct. What is the purpose of a worship service? Praise God. We get together, I just said it, to partake of the Lord's Supper, and we do all of the other things that revolve around that. So when you add it to a wedding, the purpose of the wedding is not like God is praised through it, but the real purpose of the wedding is the guy and the gal, up front, right? So you're just nailing on a spiritual activity to a wedding. Now, is it wrong? It's performative, is what it is. it's performative. Um, yeah, yeah. What since correct, and it seems to be more of a holdover from Catholicism and some of the high church functions. And so, but the reason this got asked of me is because it did happen in a Congregational Lord's Church not too, a short time ago here in the state of Ohio, and I was asked about it. And at the end of the day, what I had to tell him is this: I can't tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that it is definitively wrong. There's good arguments on both sides. But what I can tell you is that it was probably in poor taste because it is performative, right? Even if it's genuine, it's performative, right? Because the way it happens is two people are up there and they all are up there and they're holding hands and they partake the Lord's Supper. And that's not what it's about, right? And so we have to make sure that whenever we are participating in an act of worship, that we don't make it performative, right? Because the moment that an act of worship becomes performative, that is when problems come into play, right? And that is true of sermons and preaching, that is true of prayers, that is true of the Lord's Supper and singing, right? I've seen song leaders, like we argue and bicker over praise team. I've seen song leaders that it suddenly turned into a solo. And it's like, this is not participatory worship. This is us watching you, audition for American Idol. And so it needs the Lord's worship is intended to be genuine and sincere, but participatory. And the moment that we take an element of worship and turn it into performance, that is the challenge, right? But if Belafon invites me over to his house and we partake of the Lord's Supper together on a Tuesday, does that mean we're going to hell? No, I don't know that that's what that means, right? And stuff. But those are the kinds of questions that every local body has to deal with, right? And those are the kind of topics that have to be decided. But what we can all agree on is that beyond a shadow of a doubt, first day of the week, the early church partook of the Lord's Supper. And so we know as long as we make sure we do it on the first day of the week, we know we're good, right? Now, Greg brings up a very interesting point about the first day of the week, which is another thing of, according to Jewish reckoning, the first day of the week starts at 6 p.m. or technically sunset on a Saturday, right? And so some churches use that to advocate a Saturday evening service, right? And but here's the other side of that coin, right? If we go by that logic, Greg, okay, we go by that logic, what does that mean about our Sunday evening service? Tried it, nobody liked it. But yeah, or we've just got to make sure that we take that Lord's Supper at the very beginning, right? So that we sneak it in under the wire, right? But right, that's a consideration. So those are all decisions that have to be made. Yeah, Belafont.
Church in California that would have worship starting at 11 p.m. Saturday, and they would sing, have some scripture reading, some prayer, and as soon as they got to midnight, they would have the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
But what they were doing it for was to get the addicts in from off the street to
Yeah.
worship at that time, so that they would be worshiping at that time instead of maybe being tempted on Saturday night to do other things.
Right.
And I think that move is coming this way because I've heard other people talk about it.
Yeah.
I heard that like 2 years ago.
Well, the challenge always becomes, and this is the inherent challenge, is how do we have to keep the letter of the word, right? The letter of the law. We have to do what it says, right? But we also have to make sure that we are not so rigid that we do it in a way that we don't fulfill our missions, right? So, for example, all right, we could be focused on building up the body of believers and encouraging the brethren to the point that we don't reach out and seek and save the lost, right? That has happened to many a church where they basically built a hedge around the congregation and they weren't able to bring anyone in. So that could be a problem, right? Other side of that coin is we could be so focused on outreach and evangelism that we don't look towards the spiritual needs of those who are already here, right? And so in that situation, that congregation, it sounds like, is trying to keep to the Word of God, that it's Sunday when we partake the Lord's Supper, but worship is not limited to just Sundays. And so they are trying to make sure that they are good with God while taking care of their mission to seek and save the lost. For that purpose. Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
Well, I do know that, but I mean, they were saying. But they were just saying this is they seem like that's the most temptation.
Yeah. Yeah, it just I mean every congregation is different. Every city is different, right? And so yeah,
But they just that was just an extra thing to do to help those actors.
yeah,
I love that idea.
yeah. And that's again, every congregation is unique, and it's really interesting. So I got to visit with the Spring Road congregation down in Columbus this past week, and they're a congregation of a little over 100 and change, 115 or so, which is small for Columbus, which, you know, you go, that'd be huge for us. But visited with them, and they have a new minister who graduated from the Bear Valley School of Preaching out west, and he's been there 4 or 5 months, and you know he's young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and that's always encouraging to see. And so, but he and I got to talking about ministry, and the reality is that like all of our preaching schools are in the South or other places, right, or our universities. And one of the things I told him is that you just need to understand you're in Ohio now. The things that you need to minister in Ohio are going to be slightly different than what you learned in school. Now, that doesn't mean that your school learning was not beneficial. It was. But the challenges and problems that we face here in Ohio are not the same as they face in Tennessee or West Virginia, right? Sin is sin, but for example, we down south, we would never have an all gather. Like maybe a gospel meeting, maybe. But the churches down south would not say, you know what, once a month, let's get everybody together and we'll bounce around congregations. That would not happen. But it does happen here in Ohio. It does happen in Portage County. You know why? Because we all know that we're brothers and sisters, and we're who we got, and we need to support one another. And so the culture is different. And so the culture is different from congregation to congregation, even within a community, right? So we look at us and we look at Streetsboro, and there are differences based on culture and community. You go into Akron and the culture is different there. And so those are the things that the local congregation have to have the flexibility to deal with, right? Because how many of us have been working and corporate gave an edict and a directive on down the line and it got applied and it's like, this is not going to work here. You made a decision without any clue of how things work at this location because they are making decisions for all of the company. But God, in his infinite wisdom, allowed congregations to have the flexibility to minister to the community that they are in. And that is a beautiful thing and a responsibility that we have. And so, but things like partaking of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, those things are non-negotiable. We have to do it, right? Now, interestingly enough, huh? So we have been commanded to do it. Now, interestingly enough, there is no set time we gather on the first day of the week, right? That's not specified in Scripture. Now, what we know is that the first century church more often than not gathered in the evenings. So there's a good chance that when you read in Acts chapter 20 about them gathering on the first day of the week, and that's where Paul prolongs his speech until midnight, it's not that he started at 9:30 and went till midnight. It's that he probably started around 6-ish and went till midnight, which is still a long time, but it would have also included the fellowship meal, the Lord's Supper, and the other aspects. So, but there's no, we have evidence of Christians gathering at various times on the Lord's Day, but there is no set time, but most of them gathered towards the evening. Does that mean we have to? No, right? Doesn't mean that. I mean, we also don't see a morning and evening service. That's not in there. But they came they started out in the 20th century, the first part of the 20th century, as a rise in shift work became a thing. And churches wanted to be able to provide a second service on Sunday for those factory workers or those laborers who did not get off until 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Sunday, which also means that most people were working on a Sunday, right? So those are things that have happened over the course of our history that we do that have just developed out of necessity. And it's not a right or wrong situation. It is an adaptation to the environment that we live in. So that's the, that's the reality of it. Any thoughts, questions, or comments on that, Greg? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's when the Passover was. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, well, yeah, I mean, but they also weren't all sitting on the same side of the table. Like, you know, you know, like, know, it wasn't Jesus Party of 13. Oh, we only have one table with, chairs on one side. Like, I get your point, Greg. So, but yes, in all likelihood, it was taken in the evening. Christians have been taking it now for some 2,000 years. We will continue to take it and proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. Any other thoughts on that? Or, Greg's art commentary? Okay. So, another important factor of the local congregation is the collection of finances. Turn over to Acts chapter 11. Acts chapter 11. All right, Acts chapter 11 and verse 27. This is the church in Antioch. Now, in these days, Acts 11:27, now in these days prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world, and this took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, every one according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And they did so, sending it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. So we see the church at Antioch hears that there is going to be a famine in Jerusalem. Now, there's going to be a food need, basically, right? And the church at Antioch decides that it is going to engage preemptively in some benevolent work, right? Whenever we talk about benevolence, we're talking about the idea of taking care of people in need, right? And they took up a collection, and it's important to note that everyone, according to his ability, is how they did it. And then that money was sent via carrier to the elders. So we see a congregation taking up money to support Christians who are going to be in need. So that tells us a couple of things. It tells us that the early church took up funds for various purposes, right? It tells us that they could send those funds to another congregation, right? That did happen. It tells us that when it comes to the collection of funds, it is giving according to your ability, right? Elsewhere, right, Paul talks about the idea of giving as you have prospered, right? And that's an important thing. The early church has the authority to collect funds, collect money for the purposes, specific purposes that it needs, and we'll talk more about the other categories that we see. But it is not a set amount per se. So it's not that, I go to Greg and say, Greg, fork over $100, bud. Like, that's not how that works. All right. It's also not a set percentage, right? So it is not a tithe. All right. The New Testament does not obligate Christians to tithe. And so anytime a church is advocating a tithe, that means they haven't read the New Testament. That's just all that is. It also means they haven't read the Old Testament. Because if you read what a tithe actually is, it is somewhere between 10 and 33.33% of your net worth. Okay? Not your weekly take-home pay, your net worth. So do a little quick math here, all right? We'll keep it at 10%. How much is your home worth that is paid off, right? Or the equity you currently have in your home. Cool. How much is the value of your 401k or Roth IRA? Cool. How much do you get from Social Security every month? Awesome. What is the value of your paid off cars? Cool. What is the value of your jewelry and all of your tech items? Cool. Once you have that number in your head, 10% of that is what you were supposed to tithe. Yeah, ain't nobody doing that, are they? And now that's not true. Some people do. But the vast majority of people, when they attend a church where the tithe is taught, are not taught it correctly according to what Scripture teaches a tithe actually is. And it doesn't really matter because Christians aren't bound by the tithe. We are to give as we have prospered. We are to be a glad and cheerful giver. And so what that means is that if you are in a position where you can give a mite, and that's all you can give a mite, right? Or if you have been put in a position where you can give mightily, do that, right? And so there's no end to what you can give, but you give as you are able to give. And that is what the church is founded upon, that principle, right? So anytime you see a church that is teaching about tithes, and some churches will have an annual meeting with your family and say, Warren, what's the income looking like here? All right. Well, Warren, we're thinking that this is kind of what you owe the church this year. And that's what it is, right? I got a good buddy of mine who he won't care if I tell it. He grew up Methodist, and he had left. He had been a member of the church for a long time, and he ended up having to go back for a wedding or something like that. And a week later, he got a letter from the Methodist Church. And now you would think if we did that, we would have sent a letter saying, we were so glad you're here. Come back and visit us anytime, right? His letter was, Dean, it was so good to see you. We looked and noticed that you haven't been paying your tithe. Well, he hadn't been there in like a decade or more, right? And that's the way they do. Some places do it. And so, again, that is why understanding how God designed the church to function is so vitally important, right? So the church could connect money for benevolent work, right? Philippians chapter 4 shows another way in which the church is collecting money. All right? Philippians chapter 4, verse 15 and 16. It says, and you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. Also, fun fact here, the word partnership there is actually the word fellowship. And so there is a certain degree to which our giving is a fellowship activity. Interesting. We don't think about it like that. But the church in Macedonia, or the church in Philippi, had given Paul money multiple times to continue the preaching and teaching of the gospel that he was doing, right? Well, it probably functioned very similar to how the collection for the saints in Jerusalem went, in that they all gave as they had prospered. They took up a collection, and they carried said collection by appointed messenger to Paul in order to give him the funds to continue with his ministry, right? And of course, the one that we often read about, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, right? That is one that when we, separate and apart from the Lord's Supper, we often reference 1 Corinthians chapter 16. All right, verse 1. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you are also to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. So several things there. We see that this is another congregation that is collecting money, because Antioch was collecting money for the church in Jerusalem for benevolence work. The Corinthian church was collecting money at that time also for benevolent work. And Paul gives them that it is to be a weekly contribution on the first day of the week. Each of you put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, right? So that when Paul shows up, they don't have to chain the back door, right? So that Paul doesn't have to go from house to house shaking his tin cup. The goal being that the church had sufficient money, whatever the sufficient money was, to send for that purpose. So we see here the established precedent that the church has the ability to collect money, to hold money, and to send money. All of those things Paul gives them the permission to do. Also, that they may have oversight over said money, right? They can have someone who they designate as their carrier to take the gift and give it to the church at Jerusalem. So we see all of those examples, and specifically, we see the church is involved in benevolent work and in the paying of money for evangelism purposes, right? Paul elsewhere in 1 Corinthians talks about that a local congregation can support a located preacher in the model that we do. As we saw in Philippians, the church can support a missionary in the way that Paul was. And so benevolence, mission work, evangelism, ministry, preaching, the church can collect funds for all of those purposes. Does anybody notice what's not mentioned in any of these verses we've talked about yet? Any guesses? Did anybody see a verse about thou shalt collect money for the light bill? You didn't. Huh? The mortgage. Didn't see, yeah, we did not see a thing about the mortgage either, did we? And so the reality is that benevolence work, that's easy. Evangelism or mission work, however you want to categorize it, lots of stuff falls into that category as well. But the reality is that the percentage of the budget, which is not an insignificant percentage of the budget, does go to the facilities. Now, we are trying to use our facilities as an evangelism tool, right? And as an outreach tool, right? And, we've got the food room back there, the food building, and a lot of money was put towards that. And, and it's for a purpose, right? We redid the parking lot in conjunction with the cutting through for the elementary school, because the hope, the goal, the prayer is that we'll be able to, plant seeds and evangelize, right? And so, but the reality is that there is no book, chapter, and verse on funds for this, right? So what we're having to do is use our best judgment, what they call necessary inference, if you remember back from many months ago now. We know the church is authorized to collect money, right? We know the church is authorized to distribute money, right? We have a building, we have a light bill. We're going on faith that it is okay for us to collect money to pay the light bill. That's what we're doing, right? And so, it's one of those things where there's not book, chapter, and verse on it because there were no church buildings in the first century, right? And they didn't have a budget line item for fellowship meals because everybody brought something, right? And so it comes into that situation of there are some things that the local congregation has to decide on where they're going to spend their money that maybe there isn't exactly a book, chapter, and verse on. But the church has to meet together. We know that, right? And so some way or another, we're going to be having to have a place to meet, right? Because even if we weren't meeting here, let's say we're meeting next door at the school, well, we're still going to have to pay for that, right? Like, it may not be a lot, but we'd have to pay something. And so then that money would have to come from somewhere, right? So, thoughts, questions, or comments on that? So another factor of this, of the autonomy of the local congregation, means that the local congregation ought to know where its money is spent, right? It ought to know. I guarantee you, in the first century, when they're taking up the collection, they knew that this was headed to Jerusalem, right? They knew, oh, this is the collection for Paul, right? And so I think it is of vital importance to know where the money goes, and also to understand that we don't kick up to anybody else. This congregation dictates 100% where the funds are collected and they go. And I think that's a very important thing. And Alan does a phenomenal job of transparency. On any given Sunday, all you have to do is look to the left of the collection box and pick up the budget. And he gives you whatever the totals are for that quarter. So we just wrapped up a quarter, so the latest aren't there yet. But within a couple weeks, he will have the next quarter, out there. And so it's an important thing, because when you look at it, you realize normally 30-ish% of the budget goes to the building, right? Another 30 or 40% go to the preachers, and then another, at that point, 30% go to all the other things. Is that right or wrong? No, it's just the way it is. But it's good to know those things. It's important to know when you make a contribution every Sunday, where does that money go? All right, any thoughts, questions, or comments? All right, well, we are out of time there, and so we will pick up not next week, but in 2 weeks with women in Christianity. So a little teaser there of what we're going to talk about.